The Gulf of Tonkin Incident. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident in 1964 was a watershed moment in U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. In August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin Incident occurred. North Vietnamese warships allegedly attacked two U.S. warships, the USS Maddox and the USS C Turner Joy, in the Gulf of Tonkin, a body of water adjacent to modern-day Vietnam. President Lyndon B Johnson claimed that the U.S. had done nothing to provoke the two attacks and that North Vietnam was the aggressor. According to subsequent reports, the U.S. actually provoked these attacks by assisting South Vietnamese commandos operating in North Vietnam and by using U.S. warships to identify North Vietnamese radar stations along the North Vietnamese coastline. The North Vietnamese attacked the USS Maddox in the first incident, which occurred on August 2, 1964, without a doubt, though it appears that the U.S. provoked this attack. The second attack, which occurred on August 4, 1964, is still being debated. There are witnesses who claim the attack occurred, as well as those who claim it did not. Because it happened at night, the details are sketchy. The operational commanders on the two ships in the Gulf of Tonkin that night were certain an attack had occurred. Eyewitness testimony from highly trained and experienced sailors, marines, and commanders reveals radar detection of torpedo boats, searchlights from a North Vietnamese boat, thick black smoke from the target, and lights from fast-moving boats. A detailed investigation and testimony before the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations included a ranking North Vietnamese commander who stated that he participated in the attack and that it did occur. However, the National Security Agency chose to declassify more than 140 top-secret documents and oral history interviews, concluding that the North Vietnamese torpedo boats did not launch a second attack on U.S. ships in Tonkin. This was based on the research and analysis of historian Robert Hanyok, who cited no concrete signal intelligence evidence of an attack. There were no naval command and control communications or target radar emissions, as in the August 2 attack. He claimed that the only evidence was muddled and contradictory testimony from the men on board and the equipment involved in the incident. Interviews have taken place over the years to clarify the events surrounding the incidents. The United States Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in response to President Johnson's claims. This proclamation gave Johnson the authority to retaliate for the alleged attacks in the Gulf of Tonkin. The resolution empowered the President to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed forces, to assist any Southeast Asia Collective Defense Treaty member or protocol state requesting assistance in defense of its freedom. In essence, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution allowed Johnson to increase U.S. involvement in both North and South Vietnam. Before Johnson became president, approximately 16,000 Americans served as military advisors to the South Vietnamese military. Historians debate whether these soldiers were merely advising or fighting against South Vietnamese revolutionaries and their North Vietnamese allies. Despite this, following the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Johnson increased the number of American troops in South Vietnam to over 500,000. These men and women were clearly engaged in combat. By 1964, Vietnam had been embroiled in a decades-long civil war, and the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution marked the start of the U.S.'s formal involvement in the Vietnam War, with the stated goal of halting the spread of communism in the region. It was passed unanimously in the United States House of Representatives and with only 2 dissenting votes in the United States Senate. The resolution was prompted by 2 separate attacks on 2 U.S. Navy destroyers, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, on August 2 and 4, 1964, respectively. The 2 destroyers were stationed in the Gulf of Tonkin, also known as the East Vietnam Sea, which separates Vietnam from the Chinese island of Hainan. They were there to assist South Vietnamese military raids on what was then the North Vietnamese coast. Both Maddox and Turner Joy reported being fired on by North Vietnamese patrol boats, according to the U.S. Navy, but later doubts about the veracity of the second attack, on Turner Joy, emerged. At President Lyndon B Johnson's request, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, with the understanding that the president would seek their approval before launching a full-scale war in Vietnam with U.S. military personnel. However, this was not the case in the end. Following the defeat of French colonialists at Dien Bien Phu, the final battle of the First Indochina War, the country of Vietnam was divided into northern and southern halves, ruled by separate regimes, during the Geneva Conference in 1954. Elections to reform the country under a unified government were scheduled, elections that the Communists of the North, who had support in the rural South, were expected to win. However, the U.S. was committed to containing the spread of communism at the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and by the late 1950s, the U.S. government had backed South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem when he refused to hold elections. President Kennedy was himself assassinated a few weeks later, and his successor, Johnson, believed that the only way to stem the losses suffered by South Vietnamese troops was to increase U.S. military presence in the region. Was the Gulf of Tonkin incident faked? Although classified documents released in 2005 and 2006 suggest that the attack in the Gulf of Tonkin that led to the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War was fabricated, there is no evidence that President Johnson or then Defense Secretary Robert McNamara intentionally misled Congress or the American people. Nonetheless, the war was unpopular in the United States, and anti-war demonstrations began soon after the start of operations prompted by the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Faced with criticism for his decision to escalate U.S. military involvement in Vietnam, President Johnson chose not to run for re-election in 1968. His successor, Republican Richard M. Nixon, campaigned on a promise to end the war. However, 4 years later, with the conflict seemingly no closer to a resolution, he, too, would face political ramifications. By the time the war ended in 1975, with the North Vietnamese invasion of the South, nearly 60,000 U.S. servicemen had died, along with nearly 250,000 South Vietnamese troops, 1.1 million Viet Cong and North Vietnamese fighters, and more than 2 million civilians. There you have the Gulf of Tonkin incident. If you found this helpful, please hit the like button and feel free to leave us a comment telling us what you think.